Sarah Winters pulled her scarf tighter against the bitter January wind as she approached the New York Historical Society building. At 32, she was the youngest lead archivist in the institution's history, a position that had cost her a relationship and countless hours of sunlight. Today, though, might make it all worthwhile. "The Hargrove collection arrived," announced Marcus, her assistant, as she entered the climate-controlled basement. 18 boxes from that old Episcopal church in the Bowery before they demolish it next month. Sarah nodded, trying to contain her excitement. "Let's start cataloguing immediately." The Hargrove collection represented a treasure trove of 19th-century New York religious artifacts. Documents, photographs, and church records spanning from 1850 to 1890. As Sarah carefully opened the first acid-free box, the familiar scent of aged paper greeted her. "Some of these photographs are in remarkable condition," Marcus noted, carefully examining a series of portraits with gloved hands. Sarah worked methodically through the morning, documenting each item until she reached a large envelope marked simply "Baptisms, 1871. Inside was a collection of formal portraits, typical of the era, solemn-faced families gathered around infants with parish priests presiding over the ceremonies. One photograph caught her attention. A wealthy family named Caldwell, according to the inscription, with their infant daughter Elizabeth. The composition was standard, except for something unusual about the priest. While his face was clearly visible, something about his shadow against the baptismal font seemed wrong. "Marcus, can you bring the magnifier over?" Sarah called, her voice betraying her unease. Under magnification, Sarah's breath caught. The priest's shadow did not match his figure. While he appeared normal, a tall, thin man with a clerical collar, his shadow stretched unnaturally across the stone baptismal font, with elongated fingers and what appeared to be an impossible angle to the head. "That's strange," Marcus murmured. "Must be damage to the photograph or some trick of the light." Sarah took a photo with her phone and zoomed in further. "The rest of the image is pristine. Look at the other shadows. The family, the candles. They're all normal." She turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "Far Abernathy, last photograph. Elizabeth Caldwell died 3 days hence." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she carefully placed the photograph into a protective sleeve. There was something profoundly unsettling about that shadow, something she couldn't explain. "I'll need to research this Father Abernathy," she said quietly, "and the Caldwell family." As they continued processing the collection, Sarah found 5 more baptismal portraits featuring the same priest. In each one, his shadow appeared distorted in subtle ways that defied explanation. More disturbing still, each photograph bore a similar inscription on the back, noting the subsequent death of the baptized child within days of the ceremony. By evening, her eyes strained from hours of examination, Sarah packed up to leave, slipping the first photograph into her bag. She told herself it was for further research at home, but something deeper, more primal, pulled her toward this mystery. As she locked up the archive room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered something that perhaps should have remained buried in history's shadows. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the archive determined to learn more about Father Abernathy. She began with the church records, searching for personnel files from the 1860s and 1870s. "Here's something," Marcus said, handing her a thin folder. "Reverend Thomas Abernathy, assigned to St. Mark's Parish in 1865. Prior to that, he served as a missionary in Haiti." "Haiti?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. That was unusual for Episcopal priests at that time. "Duh." The file contained little personal information, just service dates and a brief note about Abernathy's death in November 1871, the same year as the photograph. The cause of death was listed simply as unknown circumstances. Sarah expanded her search to newspaper archives, scrolling through digitized copies of the New York Herald and Tribune from 1871. On November 17th, she found a small article, "Priest found dead in church basement." The body of Reverend Thomas Abernathy, 42, was discovered yesterday in the basement of St. Mark's Church. Authorities report unusual circumstances surrounding the death, but declined to provide details pending investigation. A follow-up article a week later mentioned only that the investigation had concluded with no arrests, and the church had quickly appointed a replacement. "The Caldwells," Sarah murmured, turning her attention to the wealthy family in the photograph. Here, information was more plentiful. The Caldwells were prominent in New York society, with Theodore Caldwell having made a fortune in railroads. Sarah found their family history in a society register. Theodore and Evelyn Caldwell had 5 children between 1868 and 1875. Strangely, the register listed only 4 surviving children, with a notation that infant daughter Elizabeth passed shortly after baptism, autumn 1871. 3 days after the photograph, Sarah whispered. She spent the afternoon cross-referencing the names from the other baptismal photographs with death records. All 6 infants had died within days of their baptisms performed by Father Abernathy, all in 1871. "It could be coincidence," Marcus offered. "Infant mortality was high back then. 6 infants, all baptized by the same priest, all dying within days." Sarah shook her head. "And look at this, all from wealthy families." As closing time approached, Sarah received an email response from Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, a photography expert at Columbia University. She had sent Dr. Blackwood the digital image the previous evening. "The distortion in the shadow cannot be explained by photographic techniques of the period," the email read. "If this is authentic and not manipulated, I would very much like to examine the original." Sarah arranged to meet Dr. Blackwood the next day, then headed home to her small apartment in Brooklyn. That night, she dreamed of elongated shadows creeping across her bedroom wall, reaching toward her with impossibly long fingers. She woke at 3:17 a.m., her heart pounding, to find her bedroom in darkness except for the faint glow of streetlights through her blinds. For a disorienting moment, she thought she saw a tall, thin shadow standing in the corner of her room. She switched on her lamp, and it was gone. "Get it together, Sarah," she muttered to herself. "You're letting an old photograph get to you." Still, she left the light on for the remainder of the night. The following morning, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood arrived at the archive precisely at 10. In her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, she had the commanding presence of someone who had spent decades as the foremost authority in her field. "Show me the original," she said after brief introductions. Sarah carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve, placing it under the archive's examination light. Dr. Blackwood studied it through a professional loupe, her expression revealing nothing. "The photograph itself is authentic 1870s albumen print," she finally declared. "No signs of darkroom manipulation or later alteration." She adjusted her glasses, "which makes the shadow anomaly extremely interesting." "Could it be a flaw in the development process?" Sarah asked. Dr. Blackwood shook her head. "The rest of the photograph shows perfect development. Look at the other shadows. The family members, the church furnishings, all display correct perspective and proportionality." She pointed to the priest's shadow. "This shadow behaves as if cast by a different figure entirely. See how it elongates here, and the fingers," she traced the outline, "are at least twice the length they should be based on his actual hands." Sarah felt a chill. "What's your professional explanation?" "I don't have one," Dr. Blackwood admitted. "In 40 years studying historical photography, I've never seen anything like this. If I didn't know better, I'd say someone was standing where the priest is, but casting the shadow of something else entirely." Dr. Blackwood examined the other 5 photographs, each showing the same priest with similarly distorted shadows. In each one, the anomalies were subtle but unmistakable. Elongated fingers, impossible angles to limbs, shadows that bent in ways that defied physics. "There's one more thing," Sarah said hesitantly. "All these infants died within days of their baptisms." Dr. Blackwood's expression darkened. I'm a photography expert, not a paranormal investigator, Ms. Winters. But, she paused, choosing her words carefully, my grandmother was from Haiti. She would have said this priest brought something back with him that had no business being in a New York church. After Dr. Blackwood left, Sarah couldn't shake her cryptic comment. Father Abernathy had served as a missionary in Haiti before coming to New York. What if he had brought something back, not physical, but something darker? That afternoon she contacted Dr. James Merritt at New York University's Religious Studies Department, sending him the digital images and arranging a meeting for the next day. As she worked late that evening, alone in the archive basement, the overhead lights flickered briefly. Sarah froze, suddenly aware of how quiet and isolated the room was. She could hear the building's old heating system creaking and somewhere water dripping in a distant pipe. When she looked up from her desk, she caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of her vision, a tall, thin shadow sliding across the wall. By the time she turned fully, it was gone. Her phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking." Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered her things. She told herself it was just a prank, perhaps from someone who had heard about her research. But as she hurried out of the building into the cold New York night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by eyes from another time. Dr. James Merritt's office at NYU was cluttered with books on religious history, anthropology, and folklore. A tall man with a salt-and-pepper beard, he greeted Sarah warmly, but with obvious curiosity. "These photographs are remarkable," he said, examining the digital copies she'd sent. "I understand your interest from an archival perspective, but why consult a religious studies professor?" Sarah hesitated before explaining about the deaths following the baptisms and Father Abernathy's time in Haiti. As she spoke, Dr. Merritt's expression grew increasingly troubled. Haiti in the 1860s was a complex place religiously, he said when she finished. Catholicism was the official religion, but Vodou was widely practiced, often syncretically with Christian traditions. He pulled a heavy book from his shelf. European and American missionaries frequently misunderstood and demonized Vodou practices. Some became obsessed with what they perceived as spiritual warfare. "You think Father Abernathy encountered Vodou practices in Haiti?" Sarah asked. "It's almost certain," Dr. Merritt nodded. "The question is what he did about it." Some missionaries respected local traditions. Others attempted to eradicate them. A few became fascinated in unhealthy ways. He opened his laptop and searched through academic databases. There's a dissertation from 1992 that mentions an American missionary in Haiti who was expelled by his own church around 1864 for adopting native practices incompatible with Christian teaching. No name is given, but the timing fits. If Abernathy was expelled from Haiti, how did he secure a position at a prestigious New York church? Sarah wondered. The Episcopal Church was decentralized. Records weren't always transferred efficiently, especially international ones, Dr. Merritt explained. A charismatic man with clerical training could reinvent himself. Sarah showed him the newspaper clipping about Abernathy's mysterious death. The article mentions unusual circumstances, but no details. Dr. Merritt frowned. Churches were skilled at managing scandal. Whatever happened was likely covered up to protect the institution's reputation. Before Sarah left, Dr. Merritt recommended she speak with Professor Elise Toussaint, an anthropologist specializing in Haitian religious practices. If there's a connection between these shadow anomalies and Haitian spiritual traditions, she would know. That afternoon, Sarah received an email from Marcus. Found something strange in church financial records. Abernathy requested unusual items. Black candles, specific herbs, animal bones for educational displays. Requests denied by church board, September 1871. 2 months before his death. The timeline was beginning to form an unsettling pattern. That evening, Sarah visited the New York Public Library's genealogy department to research the Caldwell family further. She discovered that Theodore Caldwell had made a significant donation to St. Mark's Church 3 weeks after his daughter's death, $50,000, an enormous sum in 1871. The librarian helping her mentioned that several other wealthy families had made similar donations to St. Mark's that same year, all following the deaths of their infants. People often donated to churches after losing loved ones, the librarian explained. It was seen as ensuring prayers for the deceased. But 6 substantial donations from 6 bereaved families, all connected to Father Abernathy. The coincidence seemed too great. As Sarah left the library, darkness had fallen over the city. Walking to the subway, she felt a strange sensation, as if someone was walking directly behind her. When she turned, the sidewalk was empty except for ordinary pedestrians several yards away. Yet, as she passed a storefront window, she glimpsed in the reflection a tall, thin figure keeping pace with her, just at the edge of her peripheral vision. When she whirled around again, there was nothing there. Her phone rang, an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "The children were payment," whispered a voice that sounded distant and strangely accented. "He promised wealth in exchange for baptism." The call disconnected. Sarah stood frozen on the sidewalk, her heart pounding. When she tried to call the number back, an automated message informed her it was not in service. Professor Elise Toussaint welcomed Sarah to her office at City College the next morning. In her early 50s, with elegant dreadlocks streaked with grey, the anthropologist listened intently as Sarah explained her discovery and subsequent research. "May I see these photographs?" she asked, her Haitian-American accent subtle but noticeable. Sarah handed over her tablet with the digital images. Professor Toussaint studied them carefully, her expression growing increasingly serious. "In Vodou tradition," she finally said, "there is a concept called the shadow self, or ombre. It is believed to be part of the soul, connected to the body, but capable of being manipulated or even captured by those with certain knowledge." She pointed to the distorted shadow in the baptismal photograph. "This is not something I would typically discuss in academic circles, but what you're showing me resembles descriptions of possession, not by a LWA, the spirits usually worked with in Vodou, but by something darker." "What kind of darker entity?" Sarah asked, trying to maintain her scholarly detachment despite the chill running down her spine. "There are rituals, very rare and forbidden even within Vodou traditions, that some believe can bind a shadow entity to serve the practitioner." Professor Toussaint chose her words carefully. "These entities require payment. Traditionally, life essence." "The infants," Sarah whispered. Professor Toussaint nodded grimly. "If this Abernathy learned such rituals in Haiti, corrupted versions, misunderstood and misapplied, he may have been attempting to use the baptisms as cover for something else entirely." She turned to her computer and searched through some files. "There was a case I documented for my dissertation, a village outside Port-au-Prince where, in the 1860s, an American claimed to be a missionary but was accused by locals of stealing shadows. Children in the village began dying of mysterious ailments. The villagers eventually drove him out." "Do you have a name?" Sarah asked urgently. "No name was recorded in the oral histories I collected," Professor Toussaint replied, "but the timing matches your father Abernathy's presence in Haiti." Before Sarah left, Professor Toussaint pressed a small cloth bag into her hand. "This is protection. Salt, herbs, and a prayer written on paper. Keep it with you. Academic skepticism has its place, but some things deserve respect, regardless of one's beliefs." Sarah thanked her, tucking the bag into her pocket. While part of her wanted to dismiss these supernatural explanations, the mounting evidence was becoming difficult to ignore through a purely rational lens. That afternoon, she received another breakthrough from Marcus. Church correspondence revealing that several wealthy families had sought out Father Abernathy specifically for their children's baptisms after hearing rumors that his ceremonies brought financial prosperity. "Listen to this," Marcus said, reading from a letter. We have heard that those blessed by Father Abernathy find their fortunes multiplied. We wish our son to receive this special blessing." "They didn't know the cost," Sarah murmured. As she worked late again that night, organizing her findings, the archive's temperature seemed to drop suddenly. Her breath fogged in the air, despite the building's heating system. In the silence, she heard what sounded like whispers in a language she didn't recognize. When she looked up from her desk, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more substantial. Her phone lit up with a text message. "The sixth baptism was incomplete. The cycle remains open." Sarah's hands shook as she gathered the photographs. According to her research, Father Abernathy had performed 6 baptisms with documented shadow anomalies. 6 infants had died. But as she reviewed her notes, she realized something she had overlooked. Newspaper records mentioned a 7th baptism scheduled for November 15, 1871, 2 days before Abernathy's body was found in the church basement. What had happened to that 7th child? And what did it mean that the cycle remains open? As Sarah left the archive, the streetlights above her flickered and went out, leaving her in darkness. When they came back on seconds later, she saw a tall, thin shadow stretched across the sidewalk ahead, a shadow with no one casting it. Sarah barely slept that night, her dreams filled with distorted shadows and the cries of infants. She woke to find that someone had slipped an envelope under her apartment door. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping she hadn't seen in her research. "Church ceremony interrupted. Police called to disturbance at St. Mark's Church, November 15, 1871. Baptism halted when mother seized infant and fled. Reverend Abernathy reportedly in state of agitation. No charges filed." This had to be the 7th baptism, the one that was never completed. 2 days later, Father Abernathy was found dead. Sarah arrived at the archive early, determined to find information about this 7th family. Marcus helped her search through the church records until they found a baptismal registry with an entry for November 15th. "Morgan infant, ceremony incomplete." "The Morgans," Sarah repeated. "We need to find out what happened to them." Census records from 1880 showed a Morgan family living in Brooklyn, William and Catherine Morgan, with a daughter, Rebecca, aged 9, which would match the timing of the interrupted baptism. "She survived," Sarah whispered, "and if she lived to adulthood, she might have descendants alive today." Marcus finished her thought. Sarah spent the morning tracing the Morgan family line forward through census records, marriage certificates, and obituaries. Rebecca Morgan had married Thomas Harrington in 1892. They had 3 children, and their descendants had remained in the New York area through the generations. By early afternoon, she had identified a potential living descendant, Michael Harrington, a 67-year-old retired history teacher living in Queens. "I'm going to contact him," she decided, ignoring the warning voice in her head. Sarah called the number listed for Michael Harrington, her heart racing, as she explained that she was researching his family history. "This is about Rebecca, isn't it?" he asked, surprising her. "About what happened at the church." Stunned, Sarah could barely respond. "You know about that?" "Family stories get passed down," Michael said quietly. "My grandmother told me what her grandmother told her. I never believed it until my mother died and left me the journals." They arranged to meet that evening at his home in Queens. As Sarah hung up, her phone immediately rang again, an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Sarah Winters," came a voice that sounded distant, as if speaking through water. "Return the photographs to the dark. What was bound in shadow must remain so." "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line had already gone dead. That evening, Sarah took the subway to Queens, the protective bag from Professor Toussaint tucked in her pocket. Michael Harrington lived in an old brownstone filled with books and family photographs. "I've been waiting for someone to come asking about this," he said after inviting her in, "ever since they announced they were demolishing St. Mark's." He brought out a leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Catherine Morgan, my great-great-grandmother. She wrote it all down. What really happened in 1871. The journal told a chilling story. Catherine had heard rumors about Father Abernathy performing special baptisms that brought prosperity to families. Desperate to improve their modest circumstances, she and William had scheduled their daughter Rebecca's baptism. But the night before the ceremony, Catherine had a terrifying dream of a shadow entity taking her child. When she arrived at the church and saw Father Abernathy, something about his eyes horrified her. During the ceremony, she glimpsed his shadow moving independently of his body. Catherine had snatched her baby and fled the church. That night, through their apartment window, she saw a tall figure watching from the street below, a figure whose shadow stretched impossibly up the building's wall. 2 days later, news spread of Father Abernathy's death. The official story was that he had fallen down the basement stairs, but church employees whispered about finding strange symbols drawn in salt and blood around his body. Catherine believed that whatever Abernathy had summoned turned on him when he failed to deliver the 7th child. Michael explained. She kept Rebecca protected her entire life, special charms, prayers. She was convinced the shadow was still looking for her. "And did anything happen to Rebecca?" Sarah asked. Michael shook his head. "She lived to be 86. But she continued her mother's protective traditions, passing them down through the generations. My grandmother did the same for my mother, and for me." He showed Sarah a small cloth bag, similar to the one Professor Toussaint had given her. "We still keep these in our homes." As Sarah prepared to leave, Michael grasped her arm urgently. "Now that the church is being demolished, things that were bound there might be released. You found the photographs, stirred up the history. Be careful, Ms. Winters. Some shadows don't like being brought into the light." Outside, the streetlights flickered as Sarah walked to the subway station. In the distance, she heard what sounded like thunder, though the sky was clear. As she hurried down the subway steps, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed by something just at the edge of her vision. The next morning, Sarah received an urgent call from Marcus. "They've started early demolition at St. Mark's," he said, his voice tense. "Preliminary work before the full teardown next month. You need to see this." Sarah met him outside the old church an hour later. The building had been deconsecrated years earlier and used as a community center until structural issues had rendered it unsafe. Now, scaffolding surrounded it, and sections of the roof had already been removed. Marcus led her to a construction foreman who explained that workers had discovered a hidden chamber while breaking through a basement wall, a small room that didn't appear on any building plans. "We found some unusual items," the foreman said, leading them down a temporary staircase. "Figured the Historical Society might want to document them before we continue demolition." The basement was damp and dimly lit by work lights. Sarah followed carefully, aware of the weight of history pressing down from above. At the far end, a section of brick wall had been knocked through, revealing a space about 8 feet square. Inside the hidden room, the construction crew had found a stone altar-like structure. Carved into its surface were symbols Sarah recognized from her research into Haitian Vodou, but distorted, combined with Christian imagery in a way that felt profoundly wrong. "There was this too," the foreman said, handing her a metal box they'd discovered beneath the altar. Sarah opened it carefully. Inside was a daguerreotype photograph unlike the others, showing Father Abernathy standing alone in clerical robes. The image was strange. His features seemed blurred, as if he had moved during the long exposure. Most disturbing was that in this image he cast no shadow at all. Also in the box was a small journal written in Father Abernathy's hand. The entries detailed his experiments, combining what he called Haitian shadow binding with Christian baptism rituals. The shadow servant requires 7 vessels to complete the binding. One entry read, 6 have been provided. The 7th will complete the cycle, ensuring perpetual prosperity for my patrons. The final entry, dated November 15, 1871, contained just one line. The Morgan woman has fled with the child. The binding remains incomplete. It comes for me now." As Sarah read these words aloud, the work lights flickered. A cold draught swept through the basement, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, like sulfur or decay. "We should go," Marcus said nervously. "The structure isn't stable." As they turned to leave, Sarah's phone chimed. A text message from an unknown number contained just 7 words. "The 7th vessel is still needed. Beware." Outside, the sky had darkened with storm clouds. As they walked away from the church, Sarah felt something brush against her shoulder, like fingers, but when she turned, no one was there, and was. The photographs and Abernathy's journal should go to the Historical Society immediately, she told Marcus, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to document everything before the building is completely demolished." As Marcus left with the materials, promising to secure them in the archive, Sarah remained staring at the old church. Something about the hidden room and Abernathy's writings suggested that the priest hadn't just been performing corrupt rituals. He had created something that persisted after his death. Something that still needed a 7th victim to complete a cycle begun over 150 years ago. That night, Sarah researched shadow entities in various cultures' folklore. She found references across different traditions to beings that existed in the boundary between light and darkness, entities that could be bound to serve but required payment in life essence. According to several sources, an incomplete binding ritual could leave such an entity partially in this world, unable to fully manifest, but also unable to return to its own realm. As she read, the lights in her apartment dimmed momentarily. In that brief darkness, she saw a tall figure reflected in her computer screen, standing behind her. When the lights returned to normal, she was alone. But her phone screen lit up with another message. "The Morgan line ends with you." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implication. If the entity needed the 7th child from the Morgan bloodline to complete its binding, and if she was somehow connected to that family, she called Michael Harrington immediately, her hands shaking. "Mr. Harrington, is there any connection between your family and mine? Did any of Rebecca Morgan's descendants marry into the Winters family?" There was a long pause before he answered. "My mother warned me this might happen someday. There was a cousin, Emma Harrington, who married James Winters in 1947. They would be your great-grandparents." Sarah sank into her chair as the truth dawned on her. She wasn't just researching this history. She was part of it. Sarah barely slept, keeping every light in her apartment blazing through the night. By morning, she had made a decision. She needed to understand exactly what Father Abernathy had been attempting with his ritual, and how to end whatever he had started. She called Professor Toussaint and explained everything: the hidden room, Abernathy's journal, and her newly discovered connection to the Morgan family. "This is more serious than I initially thought," Professor Toussaint said gravely. "If what you're describing is accurate, Abernathy corrupted a protective ritual into something exploitative. The shadow entity he partially bound has been seeking completion for over a century." "How do I stop it?" Sarah asked. "Incomplete rituals can be undone at the place they began," Professor Toussaint explained. "But it would be dangerous. The entity would resist, knowing what you intend." Sarah spent the day in the archive with Marcus, studying Abernathy's journal more carefully. The priest had described using the baptismal font as the anchoring point for his ritual, with each infant serving as a vessel to channel wealth to the designated families. "The shadow takes a portion of life essence from each vessel," Abernathy had written, "and transmutes it to material prosperity for the benefactor. 7 vessels complete the binding, ensuring the shadow serves in perpetuity." "He was essentially sacrificing these children," Marcus said, horrified, "trading their life force for wealth." And the last entry indicates the entity turned on him when the ritual couldn't be completed," Sarah added. But it's still partially bound, still seeking its seventh vessel, which it believes is you, Marcus concluded. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from the construction foreman at St. Mark's. During further demolition, they had discovered the original baptismal font hidden in a bricked-up alcove, the same font visible in the 1871 photographs. "There are weird markings all over it," the foreman said, "and the crew is refusing to touch it. Strange things have been happening. Tools disappearing, cold spots, shadows moving where they shouldn't." Sarah arranged to visit the site that evening after the workers had left. Despite Marcus's concerns, she went alone, carrying Professor Toussaint's protective charm and a small bag of items the professor had given her for a reversal ritual. The church was eerily silent as Sarah entered through the temporary construction entrance. Most of the roof was now gone, leaving the night sky visible above the skeletal remains of the once grand building. Her flashlight cast long shadows across the debris-strewn floor. In what had once been the main sanctuary, she found the baptismal font, a heavy stone basin carved with Christian symbols intertwined with corrupted Vodou Vave designs. This was where Father Abernathy had performed his rituals, where 6 infants had been unknowingly sacrificed to a shadow entity. As Sarah approached the font, the air around her grew noticeably colder. Her flashlight dimmed, then brightened again. In the shifting light, the shadows in the church seemed to move independently of their sources. "I know what you are," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the empty space, "and I know what you want." A whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The 7th vessel. The binding must be completed." "That's not going to happen," Sarah replied, removing the items from her bag. Black salt, white candles, a small mirror, and a piece of paper with symbols Professor Toussaint had drawn. As she began arranging these items around the font, the temperature dropped further. Her breath fogged in the air, and the flashlight flickered rapidly. In its dying light, she saw a tall, thin shadow detach itself from the wall, a shadow with no one casting it. It moved toward her with a fluid grace that defied physics, elongated fingers reaching out. "You cannot undo what was begun," the whisper came again, closer now. "The Morgan blood is owed." Sarah's hands trembled as she lit the candles. "No one owes you anything. Abernathy tried to bind you through deception and sacrifice. I'm ending it." The shadow lunged forward, and Sarah felt an icy grip around her throat. The candles flickered wildly as she struggled to breathe, dropping the mirror which shattered on the stone floor. In that moment of panic, she remembered Professor Toussaint's words. "Shadow entities exist between worlds. They fear their own reflection and the completion of circles." With her remaining strength, Sarah grabbed a shard of the broken mirror and held it up toward the entity. The shadow recoiled as if burned, releasing its grip. Sarah gasped for air, then quickly completed the circle of salt around the font. Following Professor Toussaint's instructions, she pressed her hand against the cold stone of the baptismal font and recited the words of unbinding, a mixture of Latin from Christian exorcism and Creole phrases from Vodou tradition. The shadow entity shrieked, a sound like wind through broken glass, and grew larger, looming over her. The candles extinguished all at once, leaving only the dim beam of her failing flashlight. "You cannot unbind what seeks completion," the voice hissed, now seeming to come from inside her own head. "The 7th vessel will be taken." In the near darkness, Sarah felt rather than saw the entity surround her, pressing in from all sides like a freezing fog. Her vision began to darken at the edges. With her last conscious thought, she pulled out the final item Professor Toussaint had given her, a small vial of consecrated water. She broke it against the baptismal font, spilling the liquid across the carved symbols. There was a sound like thunder contained within the church walls. The shadow contracted violently, then expanded in a shockwave that knocked Sarah to the ground. When she opened her eyes, moonlight streamed through the open roof. The oppressive presence was gone, and the baptismal font had cracked down the center, the carved symbols now broken and meaningless. Sarah's phone lit up with a text message from an unknown number. This time, there was just a single word: free. Sarah awoke in a hospital bed the next morning, with Marcus sitting worriedly beside her. Construction workers had found her unconscious among the church ruins and called an ambulance. "You could have been killed," Marcus scolded. "The foreman said they found you next to the baptismal font, which had somehow split in two." "It's over," Sarah said quietly. "Whatever Abernathy bound is gone now." Over the next few days, as Sarah recovered, strange reports emerged about the 6 wealthy families from Abernathy's baptisms. Descendants of the Caldwells, who had maintained their fortune for generations, suddenly found their investment firm under federal investigation for fraud. The Whitmore shipping dynasty, another of Abernathy's clients, announced bankruptcy after 150 years of operation. "It's as if all that accumulated wealth built on Abernathy's ritual is crumbling," Marcus observed as he shared the news with Sarah in her hospital room. Sarah nodded, not entirely surprised. Professor Toussaint mentioned this might happen. If the prosperity was generated through the shadow entity's binding, breaking that binding would unravel its effects. After her discharge, Sarah contacted Michael Harrington to share what had happened. The elderly man seemed to physically age before her eyes as she recounted the confrontation at the church. "My mother always said the shadow would come for our family eventually," he said, his voice trembling. "Every generation we kept the protections, never knowing if they were necessary or just superstition." He took her hand in his weathered one. "Thank you for ending this. 5 generations of our family have lived under this shadow, literally and figuratively." In the following weeks, Sarah worked with Marcus to properly document everything they had discovered. Abernathy's journal was catalogued, along with photographs of the baptismal font before it was removed from the demolition site. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood analyzed the photographs one final time, confirming that the shadow anomalies remained unexplainable by conventional photographic science. "Some mysteries are perhaps better left as mysteries," she concluded. Professor Toussaint invited Sarah to her office for tea a month after the incident. The anthropologist studied her carefully before speaking. "The entity is truly gone," she confirmed. "I perform my own divination to be certain, but you should know that such encounters often leave a mark on those who experience them." "What kind of mark?" Sarah asked uneasily. "Nothing harmful," Professor Toussaint assured her, "but you may find yourself more sensitive to the boundaries between worlds, more aware of the shadows that most people never notice." Sarah had already noticed this, subtle changes in her perception. Shadows seemed deeper, more textured. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of shapes or movements at the edge of her vision that vanished when she turned to look directly. "Is that dangerous?" she asked. "Only if you pursue it," Professor Toussaint warned. "There are other entities in the shadows, Miss Winters. Having glimpsed one, you might more easily perceive others. I would advise caution in your future archival discoveries." As the St. Mark's Church demolition was completed and construction began on the luxury condominiums that would replace it, Sarah found herself drawn to the site one last time. Standing across the street, watching workers pour new foundations, she felt a strange sense of closure. The Hargrove collection had been fully catalogued now, its secrets documented, but certain items, like Abernathy's journal and the baptismal photographs, restricted to academic researchers only. The Historical Society's board had been skeptical of Sarah's full report, but agreed to the restrictions nonetheless. That evening, as she walked home through the gathering dusk, Sarah passed a young couple with an infant. The baby gazed at her with solemn eyes, then looked past her shoulder and began to cry. The parents apologized and hurried away, but Sarah remained frozen on the sidewalk. Slowly, she turned to look behind her. For just a moment, in the space between streetlights, she thought she saw a familiar, elongated shadow, but it was gone so quickly she couldn't be certain. Her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. "Some cycles cannot be broken, only postponed." Sarah stared at the message, her heart racing. Then deliberately, she deleted it and continued walking, keeping to the well-lit parts of the sidewalk. Whatever lingered in New York's shadows, she had done what she could. The rest would be for another archivist, perhaps, in another time. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her office at the New York Historical Society, reviewing a new acquisition, church records from an Episcopal parish in Brooklyn that had recently closed. Life had largely returned to normal, though she still kept Professor Toussaint's protective charm in her pocket and avoided working in the archives after dark. A knock at her door revealed Marcus holding a newspaper. "You need to see this," he said, placing it on her desk. The headline read, "Caldwell heir dies mysteriously. Last descendant of historic New York family found in home." The article detailed how Charles Caldwell, the last direct descendant of Theodore and Evelyn Caldwell, had been found dead in his Upper East Side apartment. The cause was listed as unknown, pending investigation, but a housekeeper reported finding strange markings on the floors and walls, as if someone had been drawing with ash. "It could be coincidence," Marcus offered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Sarah read further. Charles Caldwell had recently made headlines for donating his family's historic baptismal portrait to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the same portrait featuring Father Abernathy that Sarah had first discovered. "When was the donation made?" Sarah asked urgently. 3 days before his death," Marcus replied. 3 days, the same interval between the original baptisms and the infant's deaths in 1871. Sarah called the Metropolitan Museum immediately, identifying herself as a Historical Society archivist researching related materials. She learned that the Caldwell baptismal portrait had been placed in temporary storage, pending evaluation by the photography department. "I need to see it," she told Marcus after hanging up. "Something's not right." Using her professional credentials, Sarah arranged a viewing of the donated photograph that afternoon. In the museum's climate-controlled storage room, a white-gloved assistant brought out the portrait. At first glance, it appeared identical to the copy in the Historical Society's archive. The Caldwell family gathered around their infant daughter, with Father Abernathy presiding. But as Sarah examined it more closely, she noticed a critical difference. In this version, Father Abernathy's shadow was completely normal. "This is a forgery," she whispered to Marcus. "A very good one, but not the original." Further inspection confirmed her suspicion. The photographic paper and chemicals were consistent with the 1870s period, but certain subtle details differed from the version she had catalogued. "Someone created a period-authentic reproduction," Sarah concluded. But why? The answer came that evening when she returned to the archive to check on the original photograph. The protective sleeve where it should have been was empty. Security footage showed nothing unusual. No unauthorized access to the archive storage. Yet somehow, the photograph had vanished. Over the next week, Sarah discreetly checked on the other 5 baptismal portraits. All had disappeared, leaving no trace in the archive's systems. Then the texts began again. 6 returned to shadow. 1 remains. Sarah knew immediately what it meant. The 7th photograph, the one showing Father Abernathy alone, casting no shadow, was still in the Historical Society's possession, secured in a special collection vault after the discovery at St. Mark's. "It's starting again," she told Professor Toussaint during an urgent meeting. "I thought we ended it, but somehow it's found another way." The anthropologist looked troubled. "Shadow entities are persistent. If it couldn't complete its original binding, it may be attempting a new approach." "By collecting the photographs?" Sarah asked. "Objects connected to binding rituals can retain power," Professor Toussaint explained, "especially photographic images, which themselves capture shadows and light." That night, Sarah dreamed of the baptismal font, now restored and standing in a dark room. Around it were arranged the 6 missing photographs, their glass frames gleaming in candlelight. A tall figure moved between them, its elongated fingers tracing the images. In the dream, the figure turned toward her. Though its face remained in shadow, its voice was clear. "The circle must be completed. Bring the 7th, and your bloodline's debt will be settled." Sarah woke, gasping. The room around her filled with deep shadows despite the nightlight she now kept burning. In one corner, she could have sworn she saw a tall, thin silhouette that vanished when she switched on her lamp. The next day, she made a decision. With Marcus's help, she removed the 7th photograph, the portrait of Father Abernathy alone, from the vault, telling colleagues she needed it for further research. "What are you planning?" Marcus asked worriedly as they returned to her office. "To end this permanently," Sarah replied. "The entity wants all 7 photographs for some purpose. We need to destroy this one before it can get it." But destroying the photograph proved impossible. When Sarah attempted to tear it, her fingers slipped away without damaging it. A lighter held to its edge failed to ignite the paper. Even industrial shears from the conservation department couldn't cut through it. "It's protected somehow," she realized. "The entity won't allow it to be destroyed." That evening, as Sarah prepared to secure the photograph in a safe location, the lights throughout the Historical Society building flickered and went out. Emergency generators failed to activate, leaving the building in complete darkness. In her office, Sarah heard the door click shut. The temperature plummeted, her breath clouding in the air. "Return what belongs to shadow," came the whisper she had hoped never to hear again. Using her phone's flashlight, Sarah saw that the shadows in the room had deepened, converging toward a central point where a tall, thin figure gradually materialized, more substantial than before, almost solid in its darkness. "You failed to complete the unbinding," the entity said, its voice stronger than in their previous encounter. "The 7th vessel was never truly offered." "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, clutching the photograph. "Completion," it replied. 6 are gathered. The 7th will close the circle." Sarah realized with horror that the entity had somehow reclaimed the 6 baptismal portraits, using them to strengthen its presence in this world. All it needed was the 7th, the image of Abernathy himself, who had begun the binding ritual. "And if I give you this?" she asked, holding up the photograph. "The debt of the Morgan blood will be considered paid," the shadow said. "Your line will be free." Sarah hesitated, remembering Professor Toussaint's warning about such entities being deceptive. Yet she also sensed truth in its words. It wanted completion one way or another. Making her decision, Sarah placed the photograph on her desk. "Take it, but leave my family line alone forever. The binding ends completely." The shadow entity moved forward, elongated fingers reaching for the photograph. As it touched the image, the photograph began to darken, as if shadow were seeping into the paper itself. "The circle closes," the entity whispered. The priest began what he could not finish. "Now, after generations, the binding is complete." The photograph turned completely black, then crumbled to ash on Sarah's desk. The shadow entity seemed to absorb the darkness, growing more solid for a moment before beginning to fade. "The debt is paid," it said, its voice already growing distant. "The shadows release their claim on your blood." As the entity disappeared completely, the lights in the building flickered back on. Sarah stood alone in her office, a small pile of ash on her desk, the only evidence of what had transpired. In the days that followed, Sarah searched for any sign that the entity had tricked her, that something worse had been set in motion. But the strange occurrences ceased. No more text messages appeared on her phone. The shadows in her apartment behaved as ordinary shadows should. When she contacted the descendants of the other families involved in Abernathy's original ritual, she discovered that the financial collapses had suddenly, inexplicably reversed. The Caldwell fraud investigation was dropped. The Whitmore Shipping Company found unexpected investors. It's as if something was temporarily disrupted, then restored, Marcus observed. Sarah never fully explained to him what had happened that night in her office. Some things, she decided, were better left undocumented, even for an archivist. A year later, as Sarah catalogued a new collection of 19th-century religious artifacts, she came across a small leather pouch containing a daguerreotype. The image showed a Haitian landscape with a small church in the background, the church where Father Abernathy had likely first encountered the shadow practices he would later corrupt. For a moment, as she held the photograph, she thought she saw movement within it, a tall, thin figure walking toward the church, its shadow stretching unnaturally behind it. Sarah quickly returned the photograph to its protective sleeve and marked it for restricted access. Some shadows, she had learned, were better left unexplored. In her pocket, she still carried Professor Toussaint's protective charm, a reminder that the boundaries between worlds were thinner than most people realized, and that in the space between light and darkness, some entities waited patiently, watching, and sometimes reaching through. As she left the archive that evening, Sarah walked confidently through pools of shadow cast by streetlights. Whatever debt her bloodline had owed was now settled. The shadows might still hold their secrets, but they no longer had a claim on her. Yet occasionally, when passing a baptismal font in an old church, or seeing a vintage photograph in a museum, Sarah would feel a momentary chill, a reminder that some cycles, once begun, leave echoes that never completely fade away.